want to welcome you to Link Engineering's video conversation series. My name is Shelley Latham. I am the community manager for linkengineering.org, which is a project of the National Academy of Engineering sponsored by Chevron. And today we're very excited to have Melissa Ballard and Gina Novoa-Swarovski joining us today to talk about expanding engineering opportunities with out-of-school time learning. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we're just going to get started. I'm going to have Melissa and Gina introduce themselves and tell us how they came to be talking about this subject and involved with this. Gina, do you want to start?
Sure, that sounds great. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be with you today. Again, my name is Gina Swarovski, and I'm faculty here at the Center for STEM Education at the University of Notre Dame. It's a little chilly here today, had some snow. So I became interested in thinking about how kids and families learn engineering and get interested in engineering because I was trained as an engineer. I was a chemical engineer in college, and I loved all aspects of engineering until I was going to take a job in industry. And I decided that I really wanted to think about teaching and learning engineering more so than sitting on a peanut butter process line. So I went and taught high school physics for a couple of years and then went on to get my PhD in educational psychology, looking at how young people, particularly girls, engaged in engineering projects. And that was before it was like cool to study engineering in the K-12 space. So all of my work was really in out-of-school settings. So in summer workshops, in weekend programs and stuff like that. So I kind of found my way to informal engineering education that way. After I finished up my PhD, I worked at the Science Museum of Minnesota, which is in St. Paul. And it's a wonderful institution up there if you ever get a chance to visit. And I was in the research and evaluation department there, where I was able to continue studying how kids and families were able to think about engineering in out-of-school contexts. About 4.5 years ago, I moved here to Notre Dame to take the position in the Center for STEM Education. And now I have a foot in both worlds. I still do a lot of research in informal settings, like museums and other after-school programs. But then I also do a lot of professional development for classroom teachers in the formal school setting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that program that's geared for middle school science and math teachers. And it's our STEM Teaching Fellows program here at Notre Dame. So with that, I'll kick it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So my name is Melissa Ballard. I'm the Communications and Community Manager at the Center for Advancement of Informal STEM Education, also called CASE. We are a National Science Foundation funded resource center for informal STEM education, serving a broader field of people who design experiences like program leaders, researchers, and evaluators. People like Gina, of course, are in our community. So I have somewhat of a similar, I guess, pathway into informal STEM. I also started off as an engineer, did industrial engineering at U of M, go blue. And then before I was going off to grad school, I took a summer job teaching summer camp at my local science center and just fell in love with all of the really hands-on, creative, social learning that can happen in those spaces. So I spent a few years teaching students, developing programs and curricula. And then I moved to DC and worked at the After School Alliance, which is a national policy research and advocacy organization. And I was focused on STEM issues there. And then in May, I moved to CASE. And yeah, we are working on supporting a meeting coming up for all of our principal investigators, so folks who lead, design, and research some of those federally funded projects in informal STEM. Glad to be here.
Great. We're going to kind of start the discussion off with how we define out-of-school time, what that is, and I know you have lots of things to say about that.
Cool. I am going to attempt to show a little graphic. Yeah, there's a potpourri of terms to describe learning that does not happen in school. All right. area. All right. So this is a fun graphic. You guys have probably seen some form of a STEM learning ecosystem. This one Case just worked on with NISENet, which is the National Network for Informal STEM Education. But one of the things that we think about is of all the time that learners of all ages, whether preschool, school age, teens, young adults, the amount of time they spend when they're not in a formal education environment is really huge. So for school age kids, that's about 80% of their time is spent not in school. And across the lifespan, most American adults spend about 5% of their time in school and formal ed. So what folks like Gina and I are really excited about is all of that time that can be leveraged to do fun, engaging STEM learning opportunities. And really for Case, we represent the professional field where they work at a science center, museum, a public library, zoo, aquarium, most of that like upper right-hand corner, along with online and media. These folks who are trying to figure out under what conditions do learners learn best, and which settings work best for different populations, other questions like that. So we call ourselves the Informal STEM or Informal Science field, ISE. People also use out of school time or OST, informal learning, lifelong learning. But all of those things are really talking about that space outside of the formal school day. I will stop sharing my screen. I can do that. There we go. Okay, sorry. So what Gina and I are hoping to kind of share with you guys today is a little bit about that field of professionals. We think there are some topics that are somewhat translatable, or at least we find inspiring in our work. And those mostly have to do with kind of like equity and access. We also call broadening participation in STEM. In terms of the research or sort of philosophical foundations that a lot of folks base their work around, we think there's kind of more an expansive definition of what learning and education mean. We think that has important implications for how you design and teach and facilitate learning for all age groups. So with that, I will pass it along to Gina. I think she definitely has some more to say about that.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. So, one of the things that we definitely just kind of say first and foremost is that, while the goals of all of education is really to advance people's understanding on different topics, like the informal space has some really unique things about it that makes it really exciting, particularly around STEM fields. So I think, just historically, the informal learning space has drawn on several fields of research and literature, certainly like science and engineering education work, but also educational psychology, the learning sciences, developmental psychology, and like sociology. Like all of those things kind of inform what happens in an informal learning environment. And so it's just like a much broader context for learning. And the way that we think about learning is it's not just learning content and practice, which can be kind of the main focus of what's happening in the classroom, and rightly so, given the next generation science standards and other standards that teachers have to meet. Informal spaces really, they do those things, but not at the same depth, right, that a formal classroom would do because of the nature of the systems in which we work. But there's also two really key things that informal spaces can do really well, which is they can really inspire people to create like this lifelong passion for a particular subject. So if you imagine like the little kid who walks into the dinosaur hall and is just this look of awe and wonder on their face when they walk in there, and how that can spark this really lifelong passion to really learn about dinosaurs and pursue it. Informal learning spaces are really good at that. The other thing they're really good at, in addition to many others, is really helping particularly young people who may have an identity of themselves and how they perceive themselves at school. So they may see themselves as a kid who's good at reading but maybe not good at science, or a kid who's good at math but not good at something else. In an informal learning space, people are able to recast their identity just based on the experiences that they're having in these other spaces. So someone might try like to engage in in a demo on a museum floor around science or engineering, and they might start to think that they are able to do science and engineering in a way that isn't possible necessarily in a classroom context because they've already built their identity there. So there's this really exciting opportunity for informal spaces where it's a little bit safer to try ideas and try new topics that you might not be familiar with, to kind of branch out and learn new things without kind of the normal kind of pressures and identities that you carry within a formal school context. Certainly, for engineering specifically, we love to use informal spaces to give folks a taste of engineering. We don't expect anybody to design the Golden Gate Bridge with all of the safety factor calculations required for that on the museum floor. But what we could do is really start to give them a taste of what does an iterative engineering design process look like? How can you really think about the structure of a problem and the constraints that you're facing to try and optimize a solution, all while having a ton of fun and using like materials that are really playful and exciting, and you can actually walk away from it at any point because it's another way to call the work that happens in our field is like free choice learning. It's the learner's choice whether they go or not, and so that autonomy and choice is often really motivating to people, that they can choose to do it or not. I'll say one of the last things I'll say before I turn it back over to Melissa to see if she had anything else to add on this part is just informal educators, so people who work in this space, really think about a broad range of audiences. So if you imagine if you're in the classroom and you're trying to teach sixth graders a particular concept, you have a good sense of what they know, what you need to do to engage them. But informal educators have to think about like, who are the people who are going to come to this exhibit or this experience? It could be multi-generational groups, like everybody from grandpa to your aunt to your little cousin, all doing something together. It could be people obviously who have different levels of interest in what you're trying to present to them, different levels of familiarity and expertise with it. And you're really trying to design for as broad of an audience as possible, which is like a really unique and kind of fun challenge about being, associated with this informal learning space. So I'll kick it back over to Melissa and see if she wants to add anything else at this point.
Yeah, I just want to add, I guess, kind of like a personal story. I think you kind of look at like the backgrounds of like educators in the informal space, a lot of us, like Jean and I we were a STEM professional, didn't quite see a place for ourselves. But, when you walk into like a crazy after school program where there's like materials everywhere and it seems like chaos, but it's actually like pretty rigorous learning and a lot of fun, that's really sort of the draw and excitement for us as like educators and professionals. So I love this space, and had the pleasure of being able to work with teachers and schools and districts over the years. And I think we'll dig into this more too a little bit later, but some of the interesting ways we've seen informal organizations and formal ed partner and work together, since we're all trying to serve the same kids and their families. So one thing, Gina she just wrote a blog for us about a really cool project she's been working on with the Science Museum of Minnesota. I know a lot of times too, formal folks are like, well, what does ISC actually look like? They may have been to a museum with their families or their kids, but I would be curious, Gina, if you had some like photos or some descriptions of what that looks like.
Sure. I have two quick examples to share here. So I get to try and like share my screen, make sure that I don't like blow anything up here. One moment. Okay, can we all see this adorable photo right now?
Yes.
So this project this photo is from a project called Head Start on Engineering. So I know Melissa and I have been talking a lot about kind of museums and programs, but the informal space also translates to the home. Like you learn a lot at home, and you can have activities that you do at home that are really engaging. And so the Head Start on Engineering project is funded by the National Science Foundation, and it's a partnership with a team out in Portland. and the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry out there. And what we do is we work with Head Start sites to introduce families to engineering, and then we send them home with 4 kits throughout the school year to do engineering activities just in the comfort of their home. So this like really lovely picture is featuring our bubble wand engineering design activity. You're like, well, how might that actually fit into an engineering design process? Well, really, the design challenge is that they are creating a set of bath toys for a neighbor or a friend, and they are playing with the constraints of the materials, which in this case are pipe cleaners, and the concentration of the solution that they're using. So the the bubble water that they're using. And the goal is to make as big of a bubble and as strong as a bubble as possible using these materials that they have. Families will do this for very long periods of time and have very rich conversations about things like design constraints, but in the context of this problem, and optimization, but in the context of these bubble wands. And so you can engage families and really young learners in really sophisticated engineering thinking without a ton of extra stuff. So you could just use everyday materials to do that. So I'm assuming everybody had the collective awe when this picture came up. So the second project I want to talk about is actually just one that I am consulting on right now. This is called the Space and Earth Informal STEM Education Network. It's one of the NISE-NET projects. So from that earlier graphic that Melissa showed, they have this huge project focused on space and earth science. They have just built an exhibit, and so this is what you would see more so in a museum context, where they have essentially like an engineering table there. You could see the engineering design process on the picture on the left in 2 languages, and it's the very simplified design build test one, but there are design challenges embedded in the exhibit, and also some assistance if people need tips for how to do it or how to get started. There's some suggestions there. But again, families, kids of all ages, intergenerational groups will like come and spend tons of time at this exhibit, just kind of trying out their ideas, building, testing, iterating, and really, starting to engage in authentic engineering design processes. I call it little e engineering, not the formal, again, not what you would see in a design firm engineering, which is like big E engineering. But these are the precursors to getting kids and their families excited about some of these things.
Yeah.
Wow, I love those pictures.
I know Gina's lucky that she gets to like actually see and work with kids. I feel like I've been a part of the program for several years, but yeah, one of the things when Gina and I were kind of trying to figure like what are we going to talk about, what are we going to say, we kind of got to this topic of, okay, there's sort of this excited field of folks, both formal and informal, we're doing interesting things, but how do we actually start sharing and working together? So I'm curious if you guys want to say in the chat if you've like partnered with a local ISC organization, whether it's like a library or if your school runs an after-school program. I know Gina's definitely got a lot of experience doing the teaching fellows and some other teaching training, but we're also curious to know in the chat if you guys had experience doing some of that. Maybe Gina, you want to start off with the teaching fellows, and I can talk about some of the other museum partnerships and stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll talk briefly. I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I'll talk briefly about three ways that I see connections between informal and formal learning environments that could be really powerful. So the first one, so again, the STEM Teaching Fellows Program is a 2.5-year teaching fellowship that we run here at Notre Dame. It's for classroom teachers, particularly in middle school, who teach science and math. And people apply in teams, and they go through the whole program as a team, and it's pretty fun. I know there's some friendly faces out there. Love you guys, thanks. So one of the things, there is a heavy emphasis in that program around kind of classroom practice, but we also encourage our fellows to really think about how do you engage your families and your communities in some of the STEM work that you're trying to cultivate at your school. And many of them have developed family STEM nights at their schools, or partnered with a library or a museum nearby to host a family STEM night there. And what we hear from our fellows is just, really phenomenal stories of how the ways in which they see the families interact together around a STEM activity can really shape like the way students carry that excitement into the classroom as well. So again, like informal spaces can catalyze this excitement and this interest that can really carry over into kind of the school day for students. Another connection between informal and formal learning could be just looking at what's happening in the research in both fields and how they can inform each other. So some of the earlier studies I did with parents and kids in museums looked at how parents would ask questions to their kids during the design process and how that could engage or shut down young people during the activity. So that's, for teachers, that would be all about facilitating the design experience for their students as well. So there's some nice carryover there. And then some of the other work by some leading scholars in our field around identity development and how, if you imagine kids in an after-school program, an extended one where they're solving community-based problems with culturally responsive design practices, that's a really phenomenal and empowering way for young people to feel like they're making a difference and cultivate their identity as someone who not only could engage in a STEM field, but also be like an agent of change in their communities. And the last piece, is that there are often many forms of partnership that can happen between an informal and a formal entity. So like a school district could partner with a local museum around like a PD collaboration. So I know at the Science Museum of Minnesota, we partnered with local school districts there to provide training on implementing engineering in your classrooms. And so that's just, one example. I'm sure Melissa probably has a few more, so I'll kick it back to her and see. I'm sure you want to share.
Yeah, I think especially when I used to work at a science center, there are a lot of ways we kind of worked with local teachers and districts. But yeah, I think one area too is the connection between both, like bringing together like families and bringing together like local STEM professionals. I think probably those of you who tried to get professionals into your classrooms, it's just like a hard time period. And a lot of ISE orgs also can facilitate family nights, or actually if they're an after-school summer program, they can have these kind of deeper connections with communities and with families. So they're a really good resource in that sense to help kind of bridge to a third type of partners to all work together. And I think one idea that's been gaining a lot of traction within the ISE field is this idea of sort of pathways, and that you're intentionally connecting opportunities for students. So again, kind of coming back to this ecosystem idea, and that all of us are working towards the same or similar goals. If you are teaching one type of engineering unit in your classroom, actually really knowing like what's happening at the public library. Is there, a museum summer camp that's coming up? And for those educators at sort of the city level or the town level to be communicating with each other about what's going on, so they can actually say, hey, I know Sarah at the library, she can get you signed up for this after school program. And we think I think the research shows too, that's a really powerful approach to be intentionally connecting these experiences. So as Gina was saying earlier, if we're really kind of attuned to like interest and identity and how kids are thinking about themselves in particular spaces, we want to give them multiple opportunities to find who they are, find what they like, build those skills, and be successful in different places.
Yeah, and one last thing that I'll just sneak in here before I kick it back to Melissa is that I forgot to mention that informal learning is generally very, very social. So it happens with the family. It happens with your group of friends. It happens when, you have like science on tap at a bar or somewhere, So that's a really fun part of this world. But some of the studies that I've been working on recently have really started to focus on kind of understanding what changes in learning and interest happen at the family level, because we really do believe, and I know Linda, I think, mentioned this in a comment in the chat, particularly for students from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds, it's not just their interest and knowledge development that matters, it's really the whole family unit, because in order for those interests to be supported long-term, like everybody's got to be involved in that, speaking to the ecosystem, kind of thinking that Melissa's talking about. So this is like, there have been a ton of studies on how families kind of like work together and engage in informal learning, but we're really starting to now pay attention more to how do we look at the outcomes of those types of experiences also for the entire family, not just for the student, the one student that we're kind of honing in on. So Melissa and I have been talking a ton about museums because A, we love them, and B, we have a lot of experience with them. But there's also this whole other broad world of ISE. So Melissa, I wonder if you could share a little bit more about what's happening outside of museums.
Yeah, I think one area that even I think as someone who's like, from my past experience, focused on like after school museums, like forget that like media is a really big, I think, driver of research and of producing useful things. So like SciGirls and Design Squad, a lot of that educational media. We also consider those folks to be a part of this like sphere of informal STEM education. And even though because some of the initial projects are about, what is an engaging television show, but a lot of those folks are also building out curricula and activities and things that like parents can use. So I think you start to see in these, as we know more about how learners learn best and what can support their learning, all of these different ISE partners are continue to build out resources that touch those points, which I think is pretty cool. And then of course, national parks and botanical gardens, all of those spaces. Sometimes not all of them will have, an education person, but I think they do what they can to develop programs and partnerships to support learning in schools around their areas. So yeah, we just wanted to make sure that we said that as we get so caught up in talking about probably science centers. The other place where you might think about partners or kind of working with local folks is thinking, of course, about STEM professionals, but also about grad students, undergraduate students, folks who are situated at higher ed organizations, and whether that's through like a particular departmental outreach or if it's through the Society of Women Engineers local chapter, but there are a lot of different ways to engage with academic partners, not just in terms of researchers or research.
I have a little question on that subject. I worked at a library, and yeah, we had STEM programming of various kinds, and I felt like the library wasn't always super robust about reaching out to the local schools and communities. And I also, on the other side, think that sometimes teachers are a little shy about reaching out, or they're just tapped out. They just don't have the time to really look into those. What are just some tips of, like, for both, really, for the people who are providing these wonderful programs, ways to reach out to local educators, and also tips for educators to, how do you break that ice? How do you find those opportunities? Just that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think just kind of knowing, and I had worked on a project with NISN about like museum and community partnerships. And so that we kind of unearthed a lot of almost kind of cultural differences, even between like different types of community organizations. We all use different terminology for what we call folks. And it's like for a library, it's not obvious to me that like someone with the title of circulations manager might also be their like youth teen coordinator, like 20% of their time. And so and the list of resources I think that Shelley will send out, I've always found it's helpful to just start paying attention to like other places where those professionals gather. Like the library field has a huge sort of teen media computing kind of initiative. They're also really interested in making and tinkering. So finding those sort of professional gatherings, I think, helps you start being familiar with that lingo, with that terminology, some of the cultural practices that are unique to each type of institution. And then, of course, just calling too. I think knowing that all of us have limited capacity and we're all probably maxed out trying to just do the basics to support our students, our audiences. But, I think just that initial friendly step can really go a long way. There's also in that like museum and community partnerships guide that NISET did, I think there's a really helpful graphic about like levels of partnership. So, not being intimidated the idea that like your first call has to result in like, a $200,000 like deep grant funded project that has like impressive outcomes, but it really can just be like, oh, hey, I have an email newsletter where we list our teen opportunities. Why don't I just add you to that list? There's a really a range and a spectrum of the type of commitment one can expect, and it's seasonal for everyone. It's going to change. So having that initial meeting and conversation can be really helpful.
And the one thing I would add to all of those like awesome tips is just for the classroom side for teachers, in that beginning of the year survey that you send home to parents to fill out, asking about, do you know of any other educational opportunities out there that would be interesting, often yields, like a lot of information. Just, I know that my daughter's now in first grade. And so the 2 years that I've gotten a parent survey, there's always a question of like, oh, would you ever want to like volunteer in the classroom and do something? And I'm like, I will do all the STEM all the time for the little kids. And here's like 6 different places that you could think about doing STEM with the classroom if you want. And so I think just tapping the parents of your school communities and like other connections there is a really nice place to start also, to just getting the lay of the land of what's out there.
Well, I know I think we have enough time. I'm going to add a topic that we didn't pre-discuss. But one of the, I guess, ongoing challenges that the IACO faces is around like evaluation and measurement. And I know folks in the formal world are still kind of struggling with and thinking through what is like evaluation around like NGSS look like. Particularly with engineering, right? Filling out test bubbles is not always the best indicator of knowledge and skills. So I wouldn't say that like IAC has figured it out, but there are a lot of kind of innovative ways of documenting, understanding what like learning and skill development looks like, that I think can be helpful. And I'm probably going to pass that to Gina now since you're technically an evaluator as well.
That's right. Another hat. Yeah, I think, because again, in the informal space, like we don't assess learning in the same way that we do in the formal classroom context. So you can do a lot more creative stuff in terms of like, can you embed an assessment into a video game and see how, just as part of the game, if you give kids like a different challenge and they have to approach it and solve it, can you get a really rich understanding of how their thinking and problem solving has changed within this new context? In our STEM Teaching Fellows program, we do talk a little bit about assessing these, kind of engineering experiences or integrated STEM experiences. And we're just really honest and we say it's really hard to do in the classroom. We do talk a lot about like performance assessments and creating rubrics to assess both the products that the students are creating and the processes that they engage in. But it's a really tricky thing. And there's still a lot of work to be done on how to best examine that. But I will say, like I've done a range of like I've watched videos and I've observed, like families doing engineering stuff for a long time. And you can start to identify when they're engaging in engineering behaviors through that. But to translate that into a way of assessing engineering activity and learning in a particular learning environment is, we still have a ways to go, for sure. Yeah.
And it's just hard too, because I think we see a lot of like really cool, after school programs, sort of, family programs, where like kids are creating and producing like really incredible things. But again, that like, you'd imagine particularly too for like the formal environment, when you maybe those measures don't translate very well, that can be really frustrating. Like one of the projects that like Gina mentioned earlier about, I think you probably, I don't know if you're talking about Get City in Lansing, Michigan, Angie's project. Yeah. You know, these group of students, you know, they studied clean energy, but they, you know, their sort of like outcomes where they were able to go to their like city board, water and light and talk about advocating for a different type of power plant. So understanding both the science and also thinking about what that looks like in their community and what their community might want and need, and being sort of active change agents in that. You know, is that something you can even and measure, and how can you, you know, recognize kids, reward kids for that really complex set of skills that it takes to do that?
Right. And I think it speaks to some of the limitations that are embedded in the next generation science standards. Don't even get me started on how they've framed engineering in there. But I think classroom teachers in particular face like huge challenges in trying to assess these really authentic experiences that they design, because in some ways they're more complex and more sophisticated and more nuanced than the standards allow you to assess. And so it's just really, it's a great point, and the space for ongoing work for sure. I'm looking at our notes.
Yeah. We wanted to talk about making and tinkering.
Oh, we did. Yes.
Yeah.
We did. That's me. So one of the things, lots of folks are probably very familiar with kind of the maker movement. And that's a huge thing. I think that's kind of crossing both the informal and formal realm the past decade or so. It's just really trying to get kids engaged in like design experiences and thinking through, you know, what it means to design. And so a question I get asked a lot actually is like, what is the relationship between making and engineering? Are they the same thing? Are they not? Like, how do we start to talk about this? And so there's some really nerdy and geeky like theoretical framing that I'm not going to talk about today, because it probably would be a snooze fest for most folks. But in the informal learning space, we really start to think about this continuum that we have observed that exists, and with one anchor point being just general play, just really people playing with stuff, kind of having fun, exploring it, but through play. Kind of a middle area of like making and tinkering, and then kind of an endpoint of like more like structured or a little bit more formalized engineering design process. So at any point in an informal like design experience, you could be doing any of those things. So you could be at that table that I showed earlier with kind of in that space exhibit, designing like a lunar lander. But really, you're just kind of playing around with the materials and seeing how they fit together, and what is the heaviest, and you know what would kind of achieve what you want. And you're just literally playing around. You could move more towards like a maker mindset of like, oh, I want to really build this lunar lander that looks like a giraffe or something, or like does this really like specialized feature. And then you could move all the way to kind of an engineering thing where you have your constraints kind of placed on you by the situation, the problem you're trying to solve, and you have to operate within kind of more bounded constraints. All of those things kind of speak to doing design. They all can like engender interest in design and engineering, but they're not all the same thing. So it's just like one way to kind of frame, you know, how different modes of activity within a design experience, particularly in an informal space, can still speak to engineering in different parts of the engineering design process. But not everything you see in a design activity in an informal space is going to be engineering per se. And you know, one of the key differences I think between making and engineering is there's often a much more personal personally motivating design goal. Like you want the thing that you're making to look a certain way or behave a certain way because you want it to do that. You want it to express something or look, in a particular manner. Whereas if you're actually engaging in an engineering design context, you will much more likely have those constraints given to you or like as part of the context that you're trying to engage in. So just a little bit there. And then another thing that's interesting about kind of the maker movement is like, people are like, oh, the maker movement is pretty new. And we're like, well, people have been making stuff for a really long time. Well before the last 10 years and the maker movement. So one of the projects that I worked on at the Science Museum of Minnesota and then here at Notre Dame when I moved here, it's called Making Connections. And it really looked at how do we understand culturally embedded design practices in communities of color. So all communities make stuff. And so can we start to understand the types of things and the processes that people have been making for generations, and then take that to a broader audience through a museum venue. So that we just wrapped that project up, and we have some fun stuff that we've posted on informalscience.org, which is this amazing clearinghouse that I'm sure Melissa will talk about towards the end of our time together. But there may be some useful things certainly for informal educators there, but for teachers, really thinking about how we worked with local community members and tried to engage them on discussions that were not always very easy in terms of, can you share with us some of these, very closely held cultural design practices, and can we work to understand them? Those conversations are not always the easiest to have. So that some of the materials we posted might be helpful for folks around that. Another thing to mention is that, lots of schools and lots of classrooms are thinking about starting maker spaces because it can be a pathway to engineering and design thinking. Autodesk, which is like a software company, they're the ones behind Tinkercad, if you're familiar with that. They have this really fantastic playbook for starting and sustaining a makerspace at your school. And it doesn't have to be like a gazillion dollars. Like you can use very everyday materials. They start by having you really think through what are the goals for your space and what materials and resources do you already have on hand, and then moving forward from there. So this is folks who are in the STEM Teaching Fellows program. We do a little bit of that at one of our meetings, and we've gotten great feedback just in terms of how useful it is to kind of get over that initial overwhelmed and intimidated feeling about starting a making program or a maker space at your school. I know, Melissa, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I think the other, thing to borrow from the ISE space in terms of making and tinkering, I think there's been just kind of in the vein of like accessibility and equity is a push for like low cost making, using things that you can get at the grocery store or that are easily accessible. And in particular, the California Tinkering After School Network has a lot of really interesting sort of best practices or kind of things they found, as well as actual activities that you can do. So, you can't set up a maker space, even though it's, doesn't matter if it has a 3D printer, things like that. You can really get at those same types of like STEM-rich skills using paper, tape, small motors, things like that. So I would definitely encourage you to kind of look up some of those pretty like after school, out of school time resources around tinkering that have some great activity descriptions. And that what Gina mentioned for her Making Connections project, their practitioner's guide also has a fun list of stuff as well you can use.
Yeah, I will be providing links to all of the resources that we're talking about here and some others that Gina and Melissa have gathered. Do we have time for questions? Anybody have any questions, thoughts that have come up, experiences you want to share, or if you need more information, anything to ask Melissa and Gina, that would be great. This is a good time to do it. Can you touch a little more on the access and equity piece and maybe address a little bit students with disabilities and how that comes into play and what additional resources ISEs might have to assist with that?
Do you want to start, Gina?
Sure. Yeah. I think, kind of broadly, much of the work in ISE around access and equity has been around traditionally underrepresented audiences, particularly for engineering around gender. So the underrepresentation of young women, and also race and ethnicity. There has been less work, and I'm just being very frank, around young people with disabilities, and kind of making engineering activities that are accessible in that way. I do know that there are a few. So at the Museum of Science in Boston, they worked on some coding activities for computer science with coders who had low or no vision. And so they had a great kind of set of design, they call them design charrettes there, where they really tried to workshop a bunch of activities that could speak to visitors and to learners with low or no vision around computing. So that was like really exciting. And increasingly in the early childhood space, there's some studies around children with autism engaging in engineering activities with their families and what could be particularly helpful or not in those contexts. But that's like that. All that stuff is very, very new, and so it's just kind of coming out to press at this point. So there'll be more in the near future, I think, to that end. Melissa, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say too, I think there are certainly people like maybe more at the level of, so like researchers working on some of those things. Like I would definitely not make a statement that like across zoos, aquarium, museums, that like people have all adopted like promising practices in supporting folks with disabilities, or even for just doing like engaging local communities of color or low-income populations. Those populations don't sort of historically attend informal STEM institutions in high numbers. But there's certainly research and scholarship out there around it. And like Gina mentioned, our site, informalscience.org, like you can search by, different population groups just to surface, short research articles, projects, just to find people who are working on those kinds of issues. And I think what we hope that when people do research, that other folks can take that, move it forward, try things out in their institutions or in their schools or classrooms. And just keep sharing with the community of professionals so that we all learn from each other.
I mean, one of the examples that kind of came out of our Making Connections work at the Science Museum of Minnesota is that some languages, like there's no easy translation for the word making, or, even like trying to categorize engineering in different languages, it means different things. And so there is some really interesting work around like how do different communities really perceive engineering and design, and how can that influence kind of the learning environments that are designed around that. But again, it's much more kind of on the research and scholarship side and not in the day-to-day practice. One last point I would say is that the NICE network did produce a guide for universal design of informal STEM activities, and that's been out for probably at least 5 years, probably closer to 8 at this point. And so that's a guide for informal educators who want to design experiences, but certainly classroom teachers could learn from that as well. So.
And then I guess I'd add to one of the initiatives that CASE has been working on over the past year and a half now, is one of our task forces on broadening participation in STEM, in which we invited both researchers and practitioners and evaluators across informal STEM education, but also science communication. And so the one on broadening participation in STEM is, really about, we've seen huge investments at the federal, at the state, at the local level in broadening participation in diversity, but when we still look at some of the numbers about who shows up in particular STEM careers, or has certain STEM achievements, whether at the college or high school level, there hasn't been a lot of movement. So the task force really kind of dug in to think through what are the big systemic things that we're not doing, or what are the things that we're not connecting at the local level or in practice. One of the things we found was around taking a really intentional ecosystem approach and really working with each other at the local level. Other things about making sure that we're engaging parents and families. Some of these other types of best practices are things we found as well. That suite of resources will be released in like mid-February, but we've got kind of a longer report on critical perspectives and broadening participation, a bunch of like short 2-pager briefs that you could use. They're supposed to be PD tools, so you could use them with a group of teachers if you all want to sort of engage and have discussions about race and class and all of these other elements of diversity. So we're really excited about that. But yeah, it remains a challenge for all of us, I think.
Did you have some slides that you wanted to show, Melissa?
Oh yeah, I was just going to show a snapshot of our website. I think while I have you guys here, we'll talk through a couple of the resources on our site, things that we wanted to share. So then here's our homepage. So for example, Shelley just asked a question, what's going on around people with, disabilities or other aspects of diversity. And so you can actually search like projects with that population type and see what comes up to see what people are working on, if there's been anything published. So it's a useful resource in that way. Okay. All right. So on our resources to share, we kind of had a couple of key reading. I know everyone loves to read more, but I will say this, identifying and supporting productive STEM programs in OST is a really nice, it's basically just a review of like all of the research. It's a consensus study. So it has some of those things around, intentionally connecting places where kids learn, being culturally and socially relevant, some of those key ideas that are based in research that the ISE field is striving towards. Another thing I'll point you guys at, I'm sure you're familiar with the STEM teaching tools. It's a project out of the University of Washington that had kind of short briefs, again, connecting research to practice. There's some links to Gina's work in there. And we had mentioned about the California Tinkering After School Network. And then we've also got some partnership tools that we found around the web about formal and informal. There's also the Connected Science Learning Journal, which is from the Association of Science Technology Centers and NSTA, which is a great resource. And then some activities and PD too that could be helpful. So I know Shelley will send that around when we're done, but just wanted to kind of highlight some of the things that are on there.
So if there aren't any other questions, do you have anything else you want to add, Melissa, Gina? I think this has been great. What an incredible overview. That number that over our lifetime, most adults spend 5% in school or in formal education settings really kind of blew my mind a little bit there. It looms so much larger. That does surprise me. And I know that you touched on it, but yes, the fact that a lot of the resources that we've been talking about today are available to all of us throughout our life, which is what makes them so powerful, really. It's great to have your insight in what work is being done and great ways to connect with it. So I want to thank Melissa and Gina for being here with us today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us live on this webcast. I will be posting a recording of this. It will be on our website and it will also be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to come back and revisit it, or if you want to share it with friends, colleagues that you think would enjoy it, please do. So thank you, Melissa and Gina. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep, sounds great. Thank you so much. It's been
Bye.
a pleasure. Bye.